sort of the different technology that sort of makes up this problem to try and solve this problem. And one thing that you might have seen a lot of in the media is a discussion about where the future of autonomous cars is going. And it's been going like this for many years. And I guess one of the most interesting parts about that discussion is that it always seems to be just a few years away, always just around the corner, and we'll all be driving, it will be being driven by an autonomous system. So the reason why the challenges are quite immense, and also why this technology just seems to always be just around the corner, I'll sort of cover a few of those things in this talk as well. So hopefully be interesting and sort of show you the different areas that we work in. So as a group, I'm part of the Intelligent Transportation Systems group as part of the Australian Centre for Field Robotics, as Kendall mentioned. And our goal really is to enable the future of transport. And the future of transport, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or a smart vehicle or something which can improve the way that a vehicle functions by using sensing and using computing to be able to do this. And so a lot of this requires new technologies that will be able to help the movement of people and goods in cities. And that's where the research focus is on. How do we make things better for moving people and goods around in cities? And it is a current focus of research. There's a lot of research that goes on in this area. There's a significant industry in this area. And you might have noticed with companies such as Uber and Waymo and many others, they're investing billions and billions of dollars in trying to solve this problem. And as you can see, they're still not on the road yet. So there's still some way to go. But also government is very interested in this. So government is interested because at some point in time, all these companies, someone's going to come out with a system that they're going to say, can we let this drive on your roads in Sydney or New South Wales or Australia? And the government don't want to be sitting at that table going, well, I don't know. They want to have an idea. How are they going to let this technology become part of society? How's that going to happen? And that's another thing that they're very interested in doing. So there's a lot of research in that side of things as well. So our group's real aim is to be able to demonstrate and with research outcomes, with real vehicles operating in realistic urban scenarios. So there's a lot of complexity in that, but we try to cover many of those areas. We're quite a large group now. We're one of the larger groups within the Australian Centre for Field Robotics. And I guess the reason why is because we have funding from a range of different sort of sources and a lot of different interests in the technology that we've been developing. You can sort of see that it ranges anywhere from sort of government type of things to different companies that deal with technology, including ones that deal with sensing, ones that deal with mapping, ones that deal with different types of LiDARs, one that deal with different types of cars, like from different car manufacturers. But also we have some research programs with other universities, but also we have a research program with insurance company, and which is sort of an interesting thing. You might wonder why insurers would be interested in sort of funding us to do this kind of work. And in the end, a lot of this work, all of these people are going to be involved in this process. They're making the cars, they're making the sensors, they're the government who is working on actually developing to get these things on the roads. The insurance companies have to insure them. They're also very interested to find out what their role in this will be. And so all of this sort of mixes together to form like quite a big project, which covers a lot of areas. Now, I've got a few videos. I assume they don't come out particularly well on Zoom, but we'll just, you'll be able to see some part of it. So our current focus in terms of the last couple of years have been on developing this autonomous transport on demand as sort of a mechanism to be able to sort of answer a lot of those questions that I was talking about in the previous slide. So this idea of autonomous transport on the demand to solve the last mile of transport. Let's say you get to your train station and the place where you're going is just a little bit too far away. The last mile is the thing that would take you that last part. And this technology, whilst it could be used for this, could also be used for many other things, like, for example, transporting goods, on a campus. Let's say you want to move goods around a campus, or some other kind of sort of similar sized area. But we're not really looking at, like major roads, like highways and things. We're trying to restrict the scope to be somewhat more achievable for the research that we want to do. So you can see a little bit in this video here. This car is driving by itself. Turned around, it went and picked up somebody, pulled off to the side of the road. The other passenger got in, was driving along now. It's not hitting things, which is always fortunate. and it gets to the destination. The person who is in there gets out of the car, and then it drives off by itself. So the main tasks that are involved in actually doing that safely were picking up a person, avoiding the obstacles, selecting an appropriate speed, dropping off the person. And the last one, which is a fairly broad one, is sort of understanding the context in which it operates. And I've got a couple of slides to sort of give you a feeling about what are the different contexts in which these vehicles operate and why is it important to understand them and how people should behave in the different contexts. So you've got to get a hint from that our sort of domain that we propose to operate in is more on a precinct scale. We're really not looking to solve the problem where a car could drive from, let's say, the campus to, let's say, Parramatta, or somewhere that's very far away. And in the end, that's being looked at by a lot of other groups in terms of a lot of other industry groups are looking at those sort of things. Whereas we're not so much focused on that. We like to think more on a precinct scale. So take, for example, a university campus or Olympic Park or a construction site or a retirement home or a retirement village. And all these types of scenarios have their own various transportation needs. It might be about transporting goods or people, and at different times, maybe both. Like maybe the platform can drive people around during the day, and at night it can deliver products, or it might be able to clean things, maybe have an attachment to sweep the streets or something. And so, but we're looking at that kind of magnitude of problem. So working on a precinct scale. The cars that we have, which probably a lot of you have seen driving around campus when we've been on campus, we have a number of these small electric vehicles. These electric vehicles are drive-by-wire. They are fitted out with sensors, a range of different sensors. You can see some of the ones on the screen here. There's some cameras, a LiDAR, inertial measurement units, various different sensors on board. We have GPS, a range of different things on there. And the whole idea is that these things can then control each of the motors in the wheels and also the direction. So we can use it to do the full automation task. These vehicles were made for us by a company in Victoria who have gone on to do many new things. But these platforms are very useful for us in terms of being able to demonstrate all of the different technology. They're quite small and light, so they're quite safe to operate, and particularly around other people. That company that was the one that made these ones now makes much more fancy looking ones, but effectively they're the same thing. Their sort of overall design problem they're trying to solve is making sort of like a platform which somebody can then go and put something on top of to do a specific task. So you can sort of see, with this base platform, it could have, a shuttle on top, or it could have a delivery thing on top, or it could have, any kind of utility function that's on top of there. So it could be for moving people or moving goods or cleaning or whatever it might be. But effectively, the underlying technology is the same in the way that it would operate. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time as a group is being able to sort of learn from human naturalistic behaviors and from driving data. And to that end, we collected a data set. Our group collected a data set over 1.5 years, where we drove around campus. So we started in electrical engineering, drove along City Road for a little while, through the Law Car Park, up around the main quad, up around physics, then up and down Eastern Avenue, and then back. So we did that once a week for 1.5 years. We've published this data set. It's an open source data set. Anyone can use it. But the purpose of this was really to sort of get a baseline and an understanding of how a human would navigate in this space. So what is the space? What would you expect the sensors to see? How do you expect a human to operate in these environments? And by doing this, you sort of get to understand, well, what are the expectations of the people who operate around that vehicle as well? And so over time, you can look at the behavior as it changes. Sometimes it's more busy or less busy, or the weather is different. And all these different conditions are sort of present in this data set. There's sort of underground section, there's a very busy road section, there's quiet road sections. And we sort of use this data to sort of train the models that we then use to solve specific problems. And one of the things that sort of comes from that is that there is a range of different types of environments with which we like to operate, or which a vehicle like this would need to operate. So you can sort of see on the left, we have sort of a busy road and also a very quiet road. And on the right, we have sort of lots of pedestrians in sort of the shared space. So the top one is on Eastern Avenue, and sometimes it's very crowded and it's quite hard to navigate a vehicle. The bottom one on the right is at the front of the main quad, which is sort of it's somewhat shared. Like people still have this feeling that they're sort of owning the road and that we're sort of, taking up their space. And then in the middle is sort of this transition. So the cars and the people are meeting in some way. So the bottom one is a busy intersection where people crossing and cars move around. And the top one is sort of a pedestrian crossing, but it's a very big one. So it's like a road and a pedestrian crossing, and they sort of all mix it together. So the urban environment is not just one thing. It's not just a plain road to operate in. There's other things which these kinds of vehicles, let's say, might need to operate in. Shared spaces, pedestrian crossings, big intersections, which get to be quite complicated. When you think about it, these things can be quite complicated even for a person to navigate. And so, sometimes in these types of scenarios, there's a little bit of ambiguity about who has the right of way. Are they going to stop for me, or am I going to stop for them? And this is where a lot of the real big challenges in autonomous vehicles actually come into it. When you're on a road, there's very strict rules. You stick in your lane. If someone's in front of you, you slow down and you safely overtake them. But then when you start to shift away from that, the context becomes a lot more complex. So part of the problem, and part of the thing that we really do a lot of in our research, is really trying to get a good understanding of what are the different contexts in which we operate. And then the other thing is to try and match the expectations of people. So here's two scenarios on the screen. You can see one on the left, somewhat of a road. People are walking pretty much on the footpath, which is where footpath is designed for pedestrians. And the cars sort of work on the road area. And compare that to the one that's on the right, where so it might look the same, people sort of walking usually off to one side, but it's not really meant to be where the road, the cars go here and the people go here. It's much more different expectations of the people using that space. And so one of the most important things to sort of end up with a solution to autonomous driving that will allow people to, accept the new technology. So people need to be able to accept this technology is here, and to do that, you need to match what the expectations are. People expect you to behave in a certain way if you're on a road, and they expect you to behave in a different way if you're in a shared space. And then there's also various grades of that as well. So we need to understand that. Now, I thought it'd be interesting just to sort of give you an idea of all the different types of parts that go into making an autonomous vehicle. And each one of these is really critical. None of these, if any of those is missing, then the problem can't be solved. So it's not just like a parallel set of things that need to happen. It's a sequence of things that need to happen. All these things need to be working. So in terms of sensing, we use primarily a fusion of camera. We have a number of them. You can sort of see the bottom picture there, the top picture there is where you sort of take a whole lot of cameras and you sort of stitch them together. And LiDAR. LiDAR, you can see the top one there has these rings with different colors on there. There's the lines that you can see. And those are the returns from the LiDAR. It's a scanning LiDAR. So it has, this one in particular has 16 LiDAR laser beams that spin around really fast. And then they give you the distance. And by combining the information from the vision and the information from the LiDAR, it allows us to do more than either one of the sensors by themselves. So one of the research questions that is involved in there is how best to sort of join or combine that information to make it more robust and reliable. Because each sensor has its own issues. One of the real challenges in terms of actually handling this sensor data is to look at how things work in a dynamic environment. So if you're a stationary sensor and you're detecting stationary things in the environment, there's some things about how you calibrate it. There's some things about how the measurements are coming in. But as soon as things start to move, then you have a lot of uncertainty. That uncertainty comes from how the vehicle moves over time, how well the timestamps of all the different sensors are synchronized. And another thing you can even see here is that if you're doing something that is scanning in 360 degrees, like spinning around, and you're moving at the same time, in the end, you're not actually dealing anymore with just a simple pattern, but it's more like a spiral pattern as you're driving along and your sensor sort of scanning on the road. It actually makes quite a complex spiral pattern. So one of the research questions is, how do you need to interpret this sensor data and how do you need to fuse it? So to incorporate all the things about how the vehicle is moving in the environment and all the uncertainties in the sensors and the timing and the calibration and how that all plays into it. Because it's quite important to understand that very well. From there, you can then take the next layer on top of that. So once you've detected that there are things in the environment, you can start to get a better understanding by using some of the more modern algorithms. So in the types of algorithms that we really look at in terms of the research side of things, you have things like a bounding box detector. You have things like pose detectors. So you can see the top left there is running OpenPose. It's instant segmentation. So taking an image and trying to get an algorithm that can actually like outline all of the separate objects in the scene. It's called instant segmentation. You can see the bottom one for cars and the top one for people. And these type of algorithms are really quite advanced, and they are advancing at a rate which is quite phenomenal. There's a huge amount of research in this area. And you can see this one does a wonderful job. You take a picture of the bottom, and if you had a person try to draw an outline of each of the different vehicles in the scene there, you would end up with something that looks almost exactly the same as this. And this was done just by an algorithm. So these types of things are another part of the research question. One of the really, once you've sort of detected the people in the environment, you can then see how that changes over time. So how maybe you might track somebody and how they're moving from frame to frame. But one of the most challenging questions, and one of the ones that's not solved yet from all of these different contexts, is trying to answer the question, where are people most likely to go next? So there's one thing to detect somebody, and there's another thing to detect to say, well, they're walking in this particular way. But there's another thing to say, well, that means that in 2 seconds time or in 5 seconds time, I have a good idea of where they'll be. So this is a very challenging problem. Predicting pedestrian motion is an incredibly challenging task. The reason why is because people can move and change direction very quickly. So, if you imagine you're sitting on Eastern Avenue and just watching some people, you might say, well, they currently look like they're walking in that direction. You might say where their head is facing. You might say there's some sort of body language that you can read into that. It's about say, well, they look like they're walking confidently or not confidently. There's a huge array of things that you could sort of think might be indicators of where they might be moving in the future. But anything can happen. Someone might be walking along and decide, oh, that's right, I'm not going that way, I needed to go that way, or I forgot something, or my phone's ringing and I stopped to answer it. And all these things can cause the future pedestrian motion to be incredibly uncertain. People generally give some subtle cues when changing direction, but that can be very, very subtle. And sometimes, and at the moment, there's really not a lot of good indication that these kinds of algorithms that we're dealing with can actually handle that in a particularly meaningful way. Simple models cannot incorporate subtle cues. So a simple model about pedestrian motion, or maybe like a dynamic model or something like this, doesn't really incorporate the idea that maybe that person's looking around like they're unsure of where they are, or anything else. So these things can't be incorporated into a simple model. Probabilistic estimates are important. So I guess the way to think about this is that let's say you have a person walking towards an obstacle. They might go one way, they might go another way. You might have two people that are approaching. Are they going to go left of each other or right of each other? All these things are things that can't be determined with certainty. And so from that perspective, what's very important is to be able to understand this motion with this idea that there is uncertainty. There's a probabilistic element to it. There's a probability that they might go one way. There's a probability that they might go another way. And one of the things about making a really strong prediction model is to be able to incorporate that. So your model can predict not just that they're going to be at a certain spot in the future, but what's the chance? Like, what's the likelihood? Are they very certain, sort of certain? Maybe they can have a few different choices about where they might be. But this needs to be probabilistic in nature, and these have probabilities involved. And then, so the way that you can sort of get around this is to try to train a network, a neural network, to learn these behaviors. And this is some of the work that's being done at the moment in our group. So one of the things that, I'm not going to go into details about the specifics of the network, other than to say, the thing that we've really tried to do is to incorporate the relationship between different people into the model, which was something which was quite novel. So the idea is that you can take an input as a sequence of pedestrian locations, and then by having a neural network which incorporates the relationship between the people, like maybe they might be close together or further apart, it can do a better job at predicting where they're going to be in the future. And you can see on the right here, sort of the output. So the input is going to be, the bounding boxes or an estimate of where people are in the past. This thing is going to be trained based on a bunch of samples from the data that we collect. And then the output is going to be some tracks and then some estimate in the future. We think they might be somewhere around here, or this red person might be somewhere around here and the blue person somewhere around here. By taking into account this idea that we need to understand the relationship between people. And this is the kind of thing that we're looking to get out of it. So this is from a data set that sort of looks from a camera view from up high. And you can see there's like the dashed lines is saying where the person has been. And then this sort of probability estimate, this uncertainty, this contour plot here is estimating where they're going to be. And the black dots is where they actually went. So you've got to get an idea that some of that information is sort of encapsulated into the model. So these people are standing still. So the future probability is that they're standing still. They're moving in a certain way and together. And so the probabilistic estimate is sort of following that sort of behavior. And this is somewhat close to the state of the art in this area for actually doing these kinds of predictions. I won't sort of stay in this one for too long, but similar idea. There's different strategies that we use, and most of them involve some fairly complex scenarios. It's sort of hard to describe some of these without going into some detail. But the idea is that this bottom row here, you might have two people walking together. You might have people that are walking in between other people. There's another one here where it's people walking near a person. And all these things have sort of, and the one on the end there, which is actually behind my camera, you can sort of see two people walking together towards a third person. And there's some idea that they might collide there in the future. But I guess the main thing to really take out of this is that it's not simple. Like there's no question that this is a complicated problem. Another really interesting area of research that we've done a lot of work in our group is trying to understand how to share the perception between different objects. So one of the things that in a car, and you'd know this if you drive yourself, is that you're really limited by what you can see out the windscreen and what you can see in the mirrors. And that's restricted by, let's say, if there's something that's around a corner, you can't see it because there'd be something in the way. Or maybe your vision of a person is blocked by a car that might be parked on the side of the road, and the person might be about to cross, and you can't see them because they're behind the car. So from that perspective, the viewpoint of a person or an autonomous system, which is the same viewpoint, is limited by its line of sight. So the idea that you can share the perception between people is a really interesting way to be able to go beyond this. And one of the ideas that we've sort of been looking towards is the idea that you might share the information between vehicles. So for example, a vehicle might see a person, they might transmit to the rest of the vehicles that are around that there's a person in that location. Or perhaps even like this example here, we have an intersection and something that's been installed maybe in the traffic light or something, which can see behind a building, which might be the one that's on the right there. So this infrastructure might see these people walking this way and might share that information with the car that's driving past so that they know that there's somebody around the corner. And this is a really interesting area of research because it really opens up many things like in joint planning, joint perception, to really be able to try to improve safety is the final goal. So that's another thing. I like to just spend a minute just going through some of the real main ideas between the different contexts in which we operate, because this is sort of one of the main focuses of a lot of our work. So most industry work and research work focuses on roads, mainly because there's a good business case to develop that technology. Roads are quite simple in many ways because they're structured. They have well-defined rules that can be sort of encapsulated even by the road rules. They're very well-defined set of rules. And there's also a very understood, well-understood set of expectations. If you're on a normal road, you would not expect someone would step out in front of the car. You might have a person that's standing on the footpath and a car would drive past at 60 kilometers per hour, maybe 80 kilometers per hour. And there's not this expectation that that person standing on the side of the road is going to just quickly step out in front of you. It's not to say that it can't happen, but it's not something that would generally be expected. And so in this way, we've really tried to sort of replicate this behavior in the way that we can operate in campus environments. So here's a couple of videos, which again, I hope they sort of come out all right, where we have a person, this car is driving by itself, and we have a person here who is running out in front of the car as it's driving along. And one of the things we were trying to do in this demonstration was to track this person, to predict where they were going to be, to understand that they were going to be walking out in front of us, and to sort of slow down and stop, because that's what the behavior is normally expected to be on a road. You wouldn't expect in this scenario that we would swerve to get around this person because there could be a car coming the other way or something like this. Here's another example of a sort of a similar situation. Our car is following another car. It's driving by itself. It's tracking the car. It's checking where it is on the lane, and it's trying to work out how a safe distance to go behind that car so that it doesn't have an accident, or it reduces the risk of having an accident. So what we were trying to do with this demonstration was to sort of show this idea of how a normal road operation is. The idea that you would behave like a car in this case, stick to the lane, go behind a car that's in front of you, but just go slow. And if someone runs out, you slow down and you sort of would stop as they're doing something unpredictable. This is then sort of extended to say, well, a particular scenario is a pedestrian crossing where there's a well-defined set of rules. So the expectations of a person crossing at a pedestrian crossing is that the car would slow down and stop and let the person cross, and not try to sort of weasel the way around them. So then we have another different context where we're sort of trying to emulate this behavior. And hopefully this video comes out and shows. Actually, this is a different video. I'm not sure what happened with this one. Pedestrian crossing. Here we go. So here's a simulated crossing. We have a person who's walking up towards the car. The car understands that as a person. There's another person on that same simulated crossing. And as soon as they've left the crossing, the car then says everything is clear, and then we'll actually just take off and start driving again. So the car was driving itself at that point. And we've sort of tried to rationalize this by saying that this is the expectations for a person at a crossing. Now, if there's an area which is not a pedestrian crossing, it's not a general thing that you'd see where someone would be stepping out in front of the car. There's an example here of a person on the bottom left there. You can see that's walking through the gutter. But a similar thing, at this point, you really wouldn't expect that a car would sort of slow down and stop and wait for that person to leave the road, because they're most likely just going to keep walking along in that gutter. So we tried to emulate this kind of behavior by saying that whilst it's safe to do so, we will try to actually maneuver around a person in a lane, which is not the expected behavior of something at a pedestrian crossing. So to give you an idea of what this looked like, I might pause this one really quickly. So we have a person who's walking on the side of the road. We have a car who's driving along, is trying to stay within its lane. This person has decides at one point that they're going to step out in front of the car. And the car makes the decision to sort of, slow down, but go around them. So this car was driving by itself at that point. And it made that decision based on tracking that person. Here's a probably better view of it. Tracks the person, sees that they're stepping out, uses that to make a decision that is probably safe to go around them. So it's another different type of behavior, and it's different that you'd expect from a pedestrian crossing. At a pedestrian crossing, you would sort of expect that if a person sort of veered out, they were going to step out because it's a pedestrian crossing, and the appropriate thing to do would be for the car to actually slow down and stop at that point. So in shared spaces is another different proposition. I think one way that I like to think about a shared space is more like you imagine a bike would be, like a push bike riding through a pedestrian space. It's somewhat of like a shared understanding. Bikes might ding a bell so that the person is aware of them being there, and then sort of just works its way through the crowd, trying to avoid people as much as possible and going slow when it gets to be near somebody. So this is probably one of the hardest types of areas to navigate. It's hard because pedestrians, there's so many of them, and they're all acting unpredictably. And what that means is that if you are very conservative, there's a good chance that you'll just never move, because there's always a chance that any one of these people could change the direction. So in the end, the idea really is that you have to go quite slowly and really try to do a good job at estimating where all these people will be in the future as you're driving. This is some of the more recent work that we're doing, is looking into actually doing this autonomously. This particular one is driven manually, just so that we can sort of show the complexity of the problem. And we sort of try to emulate this kind of behavior by trying to put in a range of different obstacles that the vehicle can then navigate around. So in this case, the vehicle is using its own sensors, it's driving by itself, and it's trying to plot a path in a more open sort of space, trying to do some planning to sort of see what's in front of it, and try to plot a path that sort of stays away from all the objects. You can sort of see this kind of same thing in here. You have to go across the road, there's objects there, and it's trying to make the decisions about where it's going to drive, and then before it goes back onto the lane to go back to its normal behavior. So I guess what I really want to show is that, I've sort of given 3 different examples of different contexts in which this car is sort of expected to operate. You have one which is a road, it's supposed to behave like it's on a road. We have one where it's in a sort of open space, supposed to behave like it's in an open space. And then we have one that's in a pedestrian crossing where there's a specific set of rules, and the expectations are that the vehicle will stop and not try to drive around or sneak past them. And then so the question is, well, what is the appropriate behavior for a car in all of these different scenarios? And sort of why is it important to match the expectations of the people that you're operating with the behavior of the car? So in the end, there's a few different reasons why it's really important. One is that if you can make a vehicle operate as people would expect, it reduces the uncertainty. So what we don't want is for people working near our car being very surprised at what the car is doing. If the car does something that's really unusual, there's a good chance that it could increase the certainty and even potentially result in an accident. Secondly, for this technology to ever become widespread and to get acceptance from the public, from the government, from insurers, all those 3 groups have to be very accepting of this technology for it to be allowed. It needs to be able to match the expectations of the people. And so this involves selecting the trajectory, determining the appropriate speed, and understanding what are the expectations of a specific context. So one of the areas which this sort of lends itself to, and an area of research that our group is sort of increasingly focused on, is actually trying to improve the way that we interact with people by using some kind of human-machine interfaces. So whether this is something that is using lights or somehow screens or projectors or something, or it seems more likely that the more effective human-machine interfaces relate more to the sounds that the vehicle might make. Not so much specific sounds, but maybe even simulated engine sounds to sort of imply what the car is doing. And even the motion of the vehicle. So for example, if you imagine that you were going towards a pedestrian at a crossing, if you came up and you slowed and you stopped and you just sat there very patiently, the person would expect that you're going to stay there and not try to creep along. But if you actually came in and then you slowly nudged forward, that vehicle movement is implying this impatience, and the fact that, you know, that the vehicle would look like they're in a hurry and being a very impatient driver. And so in the end, there are sort of more implicit ways to demonstrate what it is that you're planning to do that aren't so direct. Like, we're not going to flash a light or show a big sign on the front of the car saying we're going to stop. We might do that in the motion that we have or in the sounds that we make. And this is a very, very interesting area of research that we're looking into at the moment. I might actually leave that part there and focus finally on probably one of the more interesting areas that's sort of incorporating the challenge of actually making this technology and then being able to distribute this technology. So one of the things is that you sort of can understand that we've got things about how we localize ourselves in the environment, how we might encode the knowledge about what is the road rules and the speed limits, but also what is the context. So for example, can we encode the information about the way that the vehicle is supposed to behave into a map or into some kind of sort of data structure that we can store and share? And this would include information about, you know, what are the features in the environment? Maybe we'll use them to help us localize, but maybe we'll use them to try to better understand how the vehicle should behave. And the semantic, what is the meaning behind the different areas? Like, is this a pedestrian crossing? This is supposed to be a shared space. This is supposed to be acting like a road. And then one of the more challenging parts about all this is how do you sort of verify and validate that? And also, how do you update that over time? Because things are naturally going to change in environment. So the idea of mapping is not just about you know, the location of where the roads are, but it's also trying to encode some of that meaning behind it as well. And there's lots of questions about what should the format of this be? You know, should each car have their own one, or should it be shared? There's lots of questions that sort of are being asked about this at the moment. And this gives you an idea about what these kinds of things might look like. So, you know, we have here a lane-specific map, which is for one part of the university. And then we have different types of information which we might want to encode in there. So, for example, you know, where's places where you might park your car, or where are the places where the road is, and where are the trees, where are the buildings, and these kinds of things. And all this information can be encoded into this map. So I guess this is sort of the last thing I wanted to sort of leave you with, and looking at where are the next steps. So we've done a lot of work, and everybody's been doing a lot of work, but what are the next steps in trying to solve this problem? How are we going to get from where we are now, where we can demonstrate various autonomous things, until the point at which you can then finally, you know, order your autonomous Uber to come and pick you up from your house? So I think one of the real key things is being able to understand and switch context. So, you know, do this in a way that is sort of scalable, something where, you know, it's also incredibly robust, such that, you know, everybody can get a very good understanding of how the vehicle should be behaving given what the context is. We really need to have a really good understanding of humans and their motion in these different areas. So this also relates to this idea that if you have a model of how a person behaves, that model is going to be different for, let's say, a shared space compared to walking along the side of the road. And there's different behaviors there. So this modeling needs to be very specific to be able to understand that context as well. And that leads into the prediction models. So now that we have this idea of the human behavior, we now need to make models which can take the sensor data from the vehicle and then output the sequence of where we think the person might be going into the future. And most importantly is to be able to incorporate uncertainty in this process. So how sure are we that that person is going to step out? How sure are we that they're not going to step out? And use that information to make decisions. And then finally, we need to be able to interface with people. So these cars need to be able to convey their intention such that people are comfortable to be around them. And as you can see, there's a lot of different parts to this. And you know, all these challenges really need to be solved before this technology can be as widespread as you would imagine. Now I'd like to leave it there. I guess there's time for questions and things, but anyway, thank you very much for listening. I really enjoyed talking about this stuff, and I hope it was of interest. Does anybody have any questions? Everybody's still online.
I think there was a question from Jesse. He raised his hand.
I did. Hi, thanks, Stuart. That was super interesting. I kind of had two questions, but I don't know if I can. I'll just ask the first one, and if there's time, I'll ask the second one.
Sure.
So obviously, like, these environments are super complicated, and there's lots of different scenarios that, as you were showing the videos, that the car could do depending on the situation. And there's a lot of dynamic objects and things moving around. So I was kind of wondering how you go about actually evaluating what your car has done and the choices that is made, considering in a number of situations, it could do a number of different choices, and it's hard to say necessarily whether one is better than the other.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I guess the reason why that's an excellent question is because, so if you look at, there's a few ways to do it. One thing that we try to do is to sort of analyze the decisions that we make and then compare it to what the human did. So, that might be, you can take a scenario up to a certain point in time, and then you can make a prediction about, not prediction, you can say, well, what should the car do? And then compare it to what the car actually did. Now, that's not saying that the person who was driving did the best thing. And that's not saying that the person did the driving did the only correct thing. But it's something, right? It's some measure of how it behaves compared to a person, which, again, it is what it is in this case. One of the things that I think is going to be more important for us going forward is to be able to do a study of the way that people feel about what the car did or decided to do. So there's one thing about us who design the algorithms and design the navigation strategies, and we know what the car is going to do because we programmed it to do it. But somebody who doesn't know that, can they tell what the car is going to do based on either the way that the car is moving or perhaps some other, like interface, whether it would be lights or sound or something. And I think that's really where the important learnings are going to be made. Can a member of the public sort of look at our car and sort of feel what it's about to do? Well, and there's a ground truth to that as well. Like, could they tell what a human-driven car is going to do either? But in the end, I think that a lot of the way that you might measure sort of this is in that way. And that's why we've been doing a lot of work, a lot of collaborations outside engineering, because I mean, as engineers, we're very much focused on, algorithms and sensing and this kind of side of design process. But there's other groups which we're interacting with in School of Architecture and Design, for example, who deal in urban interfaces. So how people interact with urban spaces. And the technology that they look into is very, very similar to what we are doing. So like it's a new technology being introduced into an urban environment. How can you gauge what people are expecting from the behavior? How can you, and that involves studying the response from people. So we look at things like generating simulated environments or taking 360-degree cameras and doing virtual reality and things like this as a way that we can actually do a study and ask people questions. Okay, here's a scenario, put on the headset, you can look around, okay, there's a car that's going to do something, can you tell me what you think it's going to do? And these kinds of questions, which I think are really, really cool. And I think that a lot of the real learnings that we're going to get are going to come from that kind of interaction.
Yeah, cool.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thanks. And Georgia, can I ask my second question as well? Or, cool. All right. This one might be a little bit more technical. I'm not sure, but basically, obviously, self-driving cars and things like that are super safety critical. So there's a whole issue around whether you can trust the sensor data or there's a change of light, and there's so many scenarios. The reason why the data coming in might be unreliable. So, and I know there's a lot of work going on at the moment in order to try and validate and check that the sensor data coming in is valid. So I was wondering what you and your group's approach to solving that problem is and how it kind of matches up to some of the state-of-the-art stuff that's coming out at the moment.
Yeah, no, that is also a very good question. So there's sort of different tiers of this solution to this problem. I mean, one that's used very commonly is to do things in simulation. And by doing things in simulation, you can sort of take a scenario and add noise to that scenario and see what the outcomes are. So having a realistic model of the world, which there are lots, there's actually a few really quite good ones, and even a few open source ones that actually do quite a good job at this. Ones that come to mind, Kala, which is the Unreal Engine, so basically the physics behind that. One is LG Sim, which is the uses the, I lost the one in my mind. It uses another, the Unity simulation environment, which again, physics engine behind stuff. And so you're replicating in that case many of the different parts of the problem, the dynamics of the vehicle, the sensors, because it basically has virtual sensors, virtual world, virtual people, virtual other cars that can do sort of randomized things. And all the big companies do a lot of work in simulations. They have a lot of them have their own. Like Waymo definitely has their own. NVIDIA have a very good one. It's very, very expensive, but they also do this for for car companies as well. And by doing this, you can both have constructed scenarios which are completely random. You can collect data and then analyze when things didn't work like they were supposed to, and then run your algorithms with changes to it against that data to see if it does the right thing after you've made some changes or not. You can also take your data set and then make a change to some of your algorithms and make sure that it still works for all of those different scenarios. So those types of things are a really good way to do it. We do some work with various ones of these. In terms of how you handle some more realistic problems, though, which is a very good question. So one of the ways that we approach this is to use our data set, which is in the context of what we're really hoping to operate in the short term, where we have 70 odd drives around the campus under varying conditions. So like different lighting conditions, slightly different weather conditions, different amounts of people, different, sometimes there's construction, sometimes there's, different things have changed. And then what we're really trying to do is to develop a system whereby we can use our whole set of algorithms, run it against that data and see if the decisions that are made are the appropriate ones. But again, by looking at how it relates to what the human did for the driving. Do we end up getting any situations with any algorithm choices where potentially there could have been an accident or some kind of safety concern? And so that's one of the other ways that we're looking to do it. In terms of the actual car, so that's more like looking at from how a sensor approaches understanding a scene. In terms of the actual low-level things, we do a lot of work with our software to develop testing of the different actual modules themselves. So for example, running unit tests on the various different components to make sure that if we make a change, it doesn't break something. And also similar thing to really focus on a modular design for the software. So we do use the ROS platform for our cars. They do run ROS. And by doing this, we're really allowed to have a very defined modular sort of interface. So you can actually test things very easily by doing that. So lots of different strategies that we use.
Okay, thanks. That's super interesting.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. I think we have a question from Angus.
Hi. I was just wondering, I hope this question isn't too, not philosophical, but you mentioned that the integration between the autonomous cars as well as people walking around throughout UCIT is hard because people's movements are extremely random and you can't gauge what they're going to do based on their expressions or how they're walking. At what point does the liability of that kind of fall onto the individual, fall onto the person? Because if you're not able to code from your own experience or instruct the machine to be able to account for those situations, the chances are you probably couldn't do that in real life anyways as a human. So at what point does that kind of liability fall onto the individual who's making those sporadic movements, if that makes sense? How is that different to someone driving?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And that is actually one of the reasons why we have an insurance company who's funding some of our work, right? So they're interested in this question as well. There's sort of a number of different approaches to answering that question. I think that some of the analysis is being done more from a functional safety requirements point of view, is really looking at doing an analysis of what should the car do to not be the one that's at fault in an accident. Like how can you measure a scenario? And they do this by picking a whole bunch of different types of scenarios and sort of analyzing them from a very low level physics point of view and saying, well, in this scenario, given if all the sensor information is correct, then the correct thing to do is this. And if somebody does something that's completely out of the ordinary, that can happen, but it's not your fault. an example would be, right, let's say you're driving on a road and somebody's driving in the opposite direction and there's nowhere for you to drive that's different. If they go and merge into your lane, there's going to be an accident and there's absolutely nothing you can do. The physics behind the situation means there's nothing you can do. Like there's no safe decision in this scenario. The same thing would be is if you're driving down Eastern Avenue and somebody like runs at the car, like runs out really fast, like might be walking slow and you're driving past and then they really quickly run sideways. In this case, you know, there's sometimes maybe not a lot you can do other than to detect it as early as possible and to apply the maximum braking that you can in these situations. But that sort of raises another question about this idea that, you know, there's always a chance that someone might do something very strange or very unusual. And if you're always taking every possibility into account, firstly, you may not move anywhere. And secondly, you're going to have a lot of false alarms. Like say anyone who might look like a little bit of a jitter would slam our brakes on, but maybe they weren't going to step in front of us. So all these questions are raising this problem about a balance between too many false alarms or being overly conservative or being not conservative enough. And so there's a balance that you need to strike there. I mean, if you drive really, really slow and you make sure that, you know, you could say, well, if anyone did anything, I would be able to stop in time. You might have a maximum speed of 5 kilometers per hour, and it might take you a long time, and there might be heaps of emergency stops. And so, you know, from that point of view, you know, there has to be some balance. Exactly what that balance is somewhat of a philosophical question at the moment. Some people talk about autonomous cars needing to be better than humans so that they're worth to use. I have a feeling that there's less appetite for that to be really true, and that, you know, if there was a number of fatalities, a lot of questions would be being asked. Take, for example, Uber. They had a crash where they hit a person. You know, they sort of blamed it on something, but in the end, it was really the fact that their algorithms were causing a lot of false alarms, and they even turned some things off. And so, you know, in these situations, that actually shut down their program for a period of time, and you know, it asked some big questions about how they should be approaching things. You look, for example, at Elon Musk, who comes out every week and tells us that, you know, their self-driving car is just around the corner. Even you can test it now. But this is still meant to be something where the person is the one who's absolutely in charge. Their hands are supposed to be right next to the wheel. They're supposed to be making all the decisions. And if they detect that the car is doing something which is not a good decision, it's their responsibility to stop the car and make it not happen. And so at which point is that even an autonomous car? Maybe that's just an enhanced safety feature, right? Where the car is trying to make good decisions, but in the end, you're the one that's responsible for that to actually not be a thing. So there's a big difference between having a car where you have a person who's literally the e-stop. They're the e-stop. They're the ones that will emergency stop if they detect something that the car hasn't detected. And you have other companies like Waymo who already now have cars in certain areas, well-defined areas, whereby that car even will drive with no one in it to go and pick somebody up, which is a completely different problem than the one that they're trying to solve at Tesla. Well, it's not a different problem, but it's a different approach, really. There's no way that the Teslas will be able to do that anytime soon. Not like Waymo.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
I think we will send out the link now, and feel free to stay if you have more time to stay and answer questions. We'd love that, but we'll send out the link now, and if people need to go off, they can submit their forms.
Yep, and thank you, Stewart, for coming in. That was really insightful, I think, and thanks everyone for coming.
No problem. Glad to be involved. Thanks.
In the meantime, I think Rowan had a question. Are you still there, Rowan?
Yeah. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on a company like Tesla, as you were just saying, on only using cameras for sensing.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. Look, I can't see how it's a good idea, to be honest. You know, you take the point about LiDARs being a reasonably expensive option at the moment. But having said that, like, why would you limit yourself to a modality which is inherently restrictive? I mean, there's so many different edge cases that it'd be very, very hard to sort of account for. And lighting conditions and various things that would make the lighting option not a good one. And I can understand to say, well, let's just do it on cameras and radar. But my understanding is they even want to just say, well, not even radar, let's just use only cameras. And if you want to have a system which is robust enough so that the car can drive all by itself, I'm sure there'd be a significant number of edge cases, which would mean that it's not really very possible to do that. And the argument is that, well, people can do it. And so you say, well, people use only their vision, and they have like our head being the black box, right? We have vision in, which is not only true, we do also have sound, but let's say we only use vision. And then the output is moving the things and pressing the pedal. So their argument is that, well, if people can do it, it's been designed such that people can do it, but people don't do it always very well. And also people have very, very good image detection and prediction capabilities with incredibly subtle cues to be able to determine things, which can't be done with the algorithms anywhere near at the moment. Maybe the far distant future perhaps, but not anywhere close to that at the moment. So I think, to be honest, I think it's a bit of a foolish proposition. I think it's interesting, but I don't think it's good from a like robustness and a product point of view. So to be honest, I'd pick something else.
Cool. Yeah. So just probably advancements in object identification.
Yeah. I mean, you can see like they had some early problems with one of their algorithms, which wasn't very good at detecting the side of trucks. So there was a truck who drove out across a road, and it was white, and the sky was white behind it, and it didn't detect it, and it drove straight into it. And yes, that was a while ago, and things have been improved since then. But there's always going to be the possibility that without having an active sensor like a radar or a lidar that actually gets a bounce back from something, that you would be able to use that information to not do that and not hit a car that's in a weird position that it shouldn't be in or something.
Cool, thanks.
And Alex, are you still there? Do you have a question?
Yeah, hi Stuart. Just had a quick question about like sensors at like really high speeds. So like if you can imagine like driving on the highway or something like that, where like the speed can get upwards of like 100 kilometers an hour, how would driverless cars work in that situation? Because obviously the circumstance, like the consequences of like I don't know, a mix up in the algorithm is like a lot more fatal in that regard. And yeah, like what tech then goes into like sensors detecting stuff at speeds that high?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I guess there's two parts to that. I mean, one is that like you have a certain time budget with which you need to be able to process things. And in our cars, we handle it at 10 hertz. So we do our navigation loop and our sensing loop, and everything has to happen in 1/10 of a second. So you've got to get a feeling that, you have to handle all of the images, all of the LiDAR, all that stuff happening at 1/10 of a second. There's not a lot of time. So there's a difference between what you do in real time and what the fancy algorithms can do. Like the semantic segmentation, for example, unless you had a very, very, very large compute in your car, it can't do that kind of stuff in real time. Those semantic segmentation networks, they might be at maximum a few hertz or something, or even less. So there's definitely a balance between like what you can do in the time that you have. 110 kilometers per hour, that's about 35 meters in a second. 35 meters in a second, maybe it's even more. Anyway, something in that order of magnitude, right? So if you're making a decision in 1/10 of a second, that's more than that. What's 110 kilometers per hour? Yeah, it's about 35 meters per second. So 1/10 of a second, and you've already gone 4 meters, let's say, in 0.1 of a second. And so, all of a sudden, you're not so much, it's more like you need to predict further in advance. And then you have issues with your sensor range. How far can you detect things reliably? If that amount that you can detect things reliably is 50 meters or 100 meters, maybe you still only have a couple of seconds with which to respond to something. And understanding what are the constraints. So, for example, 110 kilometers per hour, you brake at maximum braking, and you're still going to take about 300 meters to stop. So there's a lot of physics questions about doing that. Now, but on the other hand, roads where cars are designed to go at 110 kilometers per hour are designed for this. They're designed to be wide open. They're designed often to be separated from the different directions. So one direction will be traveling on only together, and then the other direction has some barrier in the middle so that they can't go across it. They're designed to have limited curves, so you'd never find 110 kilometers per hour a sharp turn. So things are designed for cars to go fast and to need less information to make the decisions. So you don't have to worry about cars coming up from side streets at 110 kilometers per hour, for example. Or is there a traffic light? Because you don't have traffic lights at 110 kilometers per hour and these types of things. So the roads are designed for needing less input to make the decisions. So therefore, from the point of view of an autonomous car, actually, it's one of the more simple cases. Road markings are always better on freeways compared to off-road, compared to normal urban roads. So better lane markings, less curves, people only going in one direction, no distractions, no pedestrians about to step out onto the road, because they're separated from there as well. So from that perspective, actually, it's one of the first things that's been automated to the point. It's a much simpler problem, but it does have lots of challenges with trying to do stuff in such a short time frame to make good decisions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. It's really insightful. Cheers.
Adam, you've got a question?
Yeah, I've got a question regarding making the cars, like a single car, last a long time. Because obviously a typical car these days you could be driving it 10 or even 15 or 20 years after it was made. Whereas computer parts, like the hardware of a computer, typically last, 5 to 10 years only.
Yep.
Is that a problem that needs to be solved?
Yeah, I have to say that's probably one of the more insightful questions I've been asked about this kind of thing. You're absolutely right. An even bigger problem is that in the automotive industry, things have to be very, very cheap. They make things in large quantities. Things have to be very cheap. Their design cycle is very, very long. They might be picking all the parts 5 years before the car gets made, and getting them to be made incredibly large numbers, but incredibly cheaply. So by the time the car actually comes out, everyone's seen this. Even the expensive cars, you see a navigation system that looks like a mobile phone from 10 years ago. They always look so incredibly out of date compared to what you might get on your mobile phone. So one of the ways that they get around this somehow nowadays is to sort of do this whole, Android Auto or Apple Car thing or whatever, such that you're no longer relying on the actual car itself to be modern and updated. It's just the screen for your device that does navigation and does various other things. How they're going to do this from an autonomous perspective is a very, very good question. I think of all the car companies that I've seen, the only one I've seen who's done a really good job of this is Tesla, in the fact that they have everything gets upgraded. Like they push software updates over the air, which has its own risks. Absolutely, it's a horribly risky thing. It changes even sometimes the interface that the person has with the car overnight, and you get it there in the next day, and you've got your screens look different because they've updated the software. I mean, how crazy is that, right? It's utter lunacy to me, to be honest. But it really gives them a platform with which they can actually then update with much quicker cycles. So if you make a mistake, or if you want to include a new feature, it's not something where you need to go and buy a new car. You can just update the software. And I have a feeling that all the other auto companies will probably go somewhere down that path. Exactly, it's not a good business model to make a car that lasts forever. It's actually a terrible business model to make a car that lasts forever. I was involved in a discussion with a particular car company almost on this exact topic, and they sort of were looking for information about stuff. But they're trying to work out what's their business model going to be in 10 years time, in 20 years time. I don't like driving a car, to be honest. I would much prefer to not have to drive a car. In the future, I think the mix of public transport for doing bulk movement, if that's improved, and also autonomous shuttles or whatever it happens to be to get your last mile and things that you don't need to would be ideal for me. I'd love it, right? And maybe in transport on demand, like an Uber which is autonomous, which can just be anywhere, it'd be great. But that means that there's less people going to be buying cars. So the business model for a car company is going to be different. I have a feeling though that the most likely strategy long term is probably to have a platform which is, and also actually one final thing, and there's many parts to this, right? One final thing, electric cars need significantly less maintenance than petrol cars and have a significantly long expected lifespan. So, you know, a Tesla is designed for, what do they say, 500,000 miles or something, or 1 million miles. And it's at the point where you could go out and buy one, and the expectation is, or at least that's the promise, that that thing will last you almost for your life. So you would never need to have another one, which is clearly not going to happen, but that's sort of the planning that they're doing. So to sort of make that work, you'd need to have some way that you can upgrade parts. And I presume that that may be somewhat related to what might happen. Maybe you can update the computer, update the battery, whereas the underlying shell of the car may stay the same, but the business model may be instead actually incorporating, you know, upselling a newer processor, which gives some benefit, you know, some additional autonomous feature or whatever it might be. A new battery that gives you a longer range, I don't know, something. I have a feeling that their business model is going to need to change because electric cars are going to change that anyway. Very good question, though. These are great questions.
Thank you.
We've got one from Will.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you'd suggest to students who want to get involved in research and projects with self-driving cars but have no experience. Like, what sort of steps should we take?
Yeah, okay, that's also a good question. There are a lot of different research areas in autonomous cars. You know, from the point of view of what types of things would be useful to learn, you know, anything to do with, I think computer science side of things, there are a lot of sort of things in there that are important. I mean, a lot of this stuff is software in many respects. I mean, I did computer science and also I did mechatronic engineering, which was sort of a useful way to sort of learn many of the algorithmic parts of this problem. But having said that, there's lots of scope to do different work in different areas of autonomous cars. I think it's important to understand sort of the software design process and also the mechanical design process. But the software design process for subjects like 3760, the one where you do ROS, this kind of stuff. Because in the end, you know, this kind of modular systems allow you to take a data set, for example, and then try your own algorithms by like just taking the data, playing it back, running your own algorithm that can do something. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with that kind of knowledge. In terms of where you could take that, I mean, we do have a limited number of students that we take on for undergraduate theses. There's definitely scope for doing postgraduate study with, you know, us in autonomous cars. We have a number of different students who are working with some industry partners as well. We have a student from insurance company. We have a student who's working with a sensor company from Sydney that make LiDARs. We have a student who's working with the prediction models. There's a whole array of different areas, if you have interest in that area, where we do sort of joint collaborations with industry, and a PhD or some future study in that area could even involve that if it was something that was of interest to you. You know, that's sort of the direction I took to come to where I am now. You know, working in these kinds of areas, and I think the best thing I could recommend is to try. Well, I mean, it depends on what you're interested in, but we try to focus on more practical things. So a lot of our research is, you know, we try to actually get things working on platforms, and we try to work with industry to actually achieve interesting things, like rather than just focus on very specific, you know, algorithms and stuff. I don't actually know if that answered your question, but you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Bring it to Georgia.
Yep. This is just a bit broad, but I was just wondering, like, do you know about when like these are going to be able to be implemented, like on the scale that you're researching, like just in local areas? Because it looked like the prediction technology was like, I don't know, from the presentation, it looked like it was reasonable, like not, you know, running people over chaotically, but yeah. Well,
we haven't run over anybody yet. Actually, if you go to on Catalyst a few weeks ago, our car was on there. The presenter from Catalyst was walking across in front of the car, and they played some ominous sounding music, And was the car going to stop? And of course the car stopped. I mean, we did that take 10 times and we stopped every time. The car stopped every time. No, there's definitely a lot of work that's been done where you can make really good demonstrations of things. It's a very different proposition to then say, take everybody out and just let it go for some period of time. That's the hard part. And the thing that we're trying to do in the research side of things is really look at pushing the boundaries of, what can we do with sensors, prediction models to make things work better. In the long term, though, to take that to a product where you could then expect to call one up, a lot of engineering is required for that. For example, how does a thing keep its charge? What happens if somebody damages it? What happens if it gets damaged? What happens if it gets stuck? How does it get out of these situations? And there's a lot of questions about how to make that a viable business model. If you need to have an expert that monitors every car 100% of the time, how is that possibly going to be a good business model? You could just pay someone minimal wage to drive the thing if it's a manual one, be a significantly cheaper car. So there's lots and lots of business questions, lots of engineering questions, or even like, what if someone leaves a mess? Who cleans it up, right? There's no one in there anymore to clean up a mess. So that's one of the big things I sort of see. There's lots of people that are doing work in this sort of scale of things. Is quite safe, but there are a lot of expensive sensors on board. And you really need to make a good business case as to why you'd scale that up to make it into a product, which is something that we're looking at, right? We're looking at what's the best use case we can find for this technology so that we can actually deploy it on scale. And that once we find that, which we're sort of looking at the moment, I think then you'll sort of see a pathway to that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Awesome. I think we might just have Josh and Henry as the last two questions before we end off today's session.
Yeah, sure. You've partly answered my question just before, but I was wondering on more the ethical side, when you start going into further testing, I know with other research projects, if they want to go into human testing, there's a lot of processes which need to be done before that. And then you need consent and everything from the people you're testing on. But in your case, you can't really gather 100 people and ask them to walk around randomly somewhere in the university. So would you be open, say, if you were confident in the design and the algorithm, to just let it run in the middle of the university and just hope it doesn't hit people, and not have a big sign up saying autonomous car testing, please stay clear, or walk like at your own risk, something like that.
At your own risk. I don't think that counts as a legal catch.
Yeah. So
we told you it was risky.
Yeah, and also, like, how do you go about the first time you let it drive without like following it around, recording it or watching it? Like,
no, those are all very good questions. So from the point of view of sort of the safety, we always have a safety driver in there. And we do that because one of the real things is that, like I said before, a lot of engineering would be required to take the person out, and that's not really research. It's more it's an engineering problem. And so we need to have the resources, we need to have the time and allocate. We'd rather push boundaries in sensing and all the algorithms rather than allocate to solving the engineering problems, because it's not really what we're about. So at this stage, we're not really planning to take the person out entirely of the equation, but we're trying to make them not be involved. They're just there to monitor for safety. The ethics and these things behind it is a very interesting question. We actually have a license. Our autonomous cars are licensed. They were the first autonomous vehicles to be licensed to be able to operate anywhere in New South Wales. There are a few shuttle trials which were before that, but they were restricted to a very defined, like their actual licensing was in this exact area, you can operate in a certain way. Whereas ours is different. We have a license which was signed off by the Minister of Transport to allow us to go to Transport and say, we want to do a trial here. This is the environment. Here's a picture of it. This is what we're going to do. Then they sign off on that. And then, under our licensing, we're allowed to do that. So we're actually legally allowed on the road as an autonomous vehicle because we went through this process. which was a hell of a process, to be honest. So from that point of view, like we're allowed to because we have insurance, we have a plan. It's been signed off by an external party, like Transport for New South Wales actually sign off on our proposals. The ethics of including it in a research perspective is a completely different problem. So most of the work that we've done from the engineering side of things has not required ethics approval because we haven't been experimenting on people. It's mostly been, the people within our group who know exactly what's happening. We have some fixed scenarios that we're testing out to see how it would behave. Or we've got the human-driven vehicle, which we then apply our algorithms to see what it would do. So in those cases, we're not experimenting on people. Having said that, when we've been doing testing with the Department of the School of Architecture and Design, we've actually been dealing with questions of, even if it's just with putting a headset on, here's a 3D representation of an environment or from a 360-degree camera, and asking them questions, that requires ethics approval, and we go through those processes to get that through the university. So if you want to publish a paper where you say we studied 10 people's response to this thing and something, you need ethics approval for that through the university. So we do that, but it is a fine line, and it is something that, to be honest with you, we weren't that familiar with that process because we've just been dealing with algorithms and hardware and all these things rather than actually getting people to do things like, step in front of the vehicle and let's see what happens. And how did you feel about that? Were you terrified? Was that an awesome experience for you? So yeah, that actually does require ethics approval to do those questions.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. We'll have Henry as our last question for today.
I've got a bit of a more technical question. How well do the sensors in your autonomous car platform hold up in rain and other extreme weather?
So the sensors themselves, they hold up okay. The algorithms, not so much, especially with, I think like light rain's okay, but as soon as you get to more than, especially fog, LiDAR and fog don't go together. LiDAR and rain, heavy rain is very bad for them. Different LiDARs have different properties. Cameras, the algorithms that they use are affected by rain to some extent, depending on how heavy it is. More to our problem is that our cars aren't waterproof. So if it starts to rain, we very quickly find undercover, and we're often found sheltering in the law car park or under one of the awnings or something like that, because our cars themselves aren't waterproof. Not so much the body of the car is fine. It's just that all our compute is sort of only semi-shaded from the rain. It stands up for a light shower, but it wouldn't stand up to heavy rain. So that's our biggest problem. In the future, we actually have plans to automate a larger vehicle. So we have some ideas, and we're getting some sensors already for this, in which case that thing will be done. And so we'll be doing more testing of the rain. But having said that, absolutely, rain and inclement weather is still an unsolved problem. That people are getting towards it, but even if it reduces your probability of detecting things properly by a little bit, it's probably not enough to be able to then let it run by itself. So most of the autonomous programs around the world, they don't operate usually in the rain. Some do, but to limited extent.
Thank you.
It's what I call the too hard basket.
Because the thing is that humans are worse in the rain as well.
Yeah, that is true. And also the physics changes dramatically as well. So the safety factors have to be changed as well. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. These have been all great questions, by the way. It's been really, really interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for giving this wonderful talk, Stewart. I think, does anyone else have a final question? We may leave it at that. So thank you so much for coming, guys. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for presenting. Is there anything else to add, Georgia?
No, I think that's it. Yep, thanks, Stewart.
No problem. Thank you, everybody. I've been glad to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.